This is BBC Radio 3. It's just gone 10 o'clock. Time now for Nightwaves with Matthew Sweet.
At the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, there are some birthday celebrations going on. The artist William Tillyer is 75 this year, and the gallery has filled itself with his work. Oil paintings, watercolours, prints, installations and polychromatic glass works. They're not alone. This autumn, Tillyer's work will be going up at the North York Moors National Park Gallery, the Platform A Gallery in Middlesbrough and the Bernard Jacobson Gallery in London. We played a small part in this too. At the Radio 3 Free Thinking Festival, we invited him to Sage Gateshead, where he discussed his art with BBC Look North's reporter Sharuna Sagar.
Welcome, William.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
So can we first start by talking about growing up in Middlesbrough? Your dad ran a hardware store in the town, so were you expected to follow in your dad's footsteps?
Of course. Nevertheless, I was self-absorbed, as most artists are. The art thing was always very strong. There was one other option, and I'd always thought of possibly being a farmer, and I think the other option was to be a monk. But strangely, both those activities, the farmer with working with the seasons and growth, and the monk with his introspection and routine, a common denominator, I suppose, of all those things, which is, I think, a boon, as it were, is to be in control of your own time, which is a great luxury, I think.
So your surroundings were very interesting. You had the industrial side of Middlesbrough, and then not so far away on the edges of it, the beautiful countryside. So how did you respond to your surroundings?
It is incredibly industrial, and certainly was in the 1950s when I was growing up, because the ICI, the Imperial Chemical Industry, was very strong and powerful at the time. But it has edges, and it's surrounded by wonderful countryside. And that kind of contrast somehow made an impression on me, which involves an amalgam of those two worlds. It's not one or the other, it's where they touch.
So the moment that had a huge impact on how you view the world in your art was a trip to Kerry, I understand.
I was invited to take part in it's an artist retreat on the very furthest western tip of Kerry, right out in the Atlantic. And the weather there is paramount. I mean, the way the clouds formed and were affected by the change from sea to land and so on. I mean, that was definitely, in my mind, recognised as a system. And that word system is something that I've always tried to work with. It sort of reinforced certain ideas one has about the interconnectivity of land, sea, air and water.
Well, when I recently visited you at your studio in Stokesley, you were just on the cusp of not touching a painting anymore, that you were finishing it off. The Triple Parma. Now, that was a very visceral explosion of blues and greens and purples, and it was quite a large mesh, three-panelled piece of art. In terms of interconnectivity, how would you describe it?
Well, as you say, the piece was called Parma. Palmer being Samuel Palmer, the English watercolourist. And I'd picked up on a quote in one of his notebooks, which goes, "Clouds dropping fatness on the earth." And the word fatness was the one that really hooked me. And that was sort of connecting air, wind, light with the organic rock forms, land, an interconnectivity between form and space. So that became an excuse to make a painting. And then there's the formal aspects of making a painting as well. As you say, it's worked on a grid. I think we all know that with a particular grid, wherever you start on that grid, you can connect to any other point within that grid. And this grid happened to be an unsupported mesh, which I pressed paint through from the backside of it, as it were, almost in a metaphor. That's how I call it, or think of it, in a metaphor for the way many of us live today, which is pressurized, there's a conformity element to our lives. And it was also a way of dealing with paint and support.
It's quite an interesting technique because you're pushing paint through the mesh and you're not able to see actually what it's going to look like until you run around the front and have a look at it.
Yes, well, that's just to be difficult about the act of painting. Stand behind it instead of in front of it. Almost like pushing cheese through a cheese grater. So it squirms through, and you can control that by the viscosity of the paint.
Now let's move on to watercolours. What is it that watercolour allows you to do?
Well, the painting we've been talking about is very opaque, and it also has volume. So obviously the opposite to that is transparency and lack of volume, which is watercolour. And there was a time in the 1960s, particularly 65, 66, where I was making pieces which were very much, I think we'd call them sort of deux champion nowadays, where one has a thought and simply puts that down. But I was realising that it was very much a cul-de-sac, particularly for me. And I think it is a cul-de-sac for a lot of art. But I decided very much to get to the end of the cul-de-sac and turn around and come back. So my painting started having, well, for want of a better word, the word emotion. And I started looking or using the landscape again. And so I went off on various watercolour trips. And in some ways they became known as the hotel or motel watercolours, because I used to drive usually during the day observing, and then since I was on my own I would work in the evenings, possibly in a motel room, using the bed as a bench, as it were.
Some of your watercolours, they do capture the look of puddles and a real sense of the weather, particularly over the Yorkshire Hills.
You do become very much a weather watcher. There's an interesting thing with, say, the English artist John Constable. An element which isn't often touched on with his work is his use of impasto paint, particularly white paint, which gives an almost all-over grid of light flickering and touching form and air.
And do you see yourself as part of that tradition of landscape artists then?
Well, it might sound very presumptuous, but yes.
Do you feel that the art world and contemporary taste in particular are controlled by too few people?
I think so now. I mean, the art world is very much sort of hijacked, I find. I think hijacking is perhaps a good word. You know, there are possibly 4 or 5 mega galleries, plus the auction houses, of course, which really are controlling the whole business of the art world, along with curators, of course. And that, because they are so big, they're drawing in a lot of very indifferent work, or perhaps insignificant work. But however, that's going for not insignificant amounts of money. It's a kind of voracious appetite that's happening. Certain commercial galleries are getting so mega that they're having to suck in. Like all big things have a big appetite, and there isn't enough good art to feed that appetite.
Now we'd like to open up for questions from the audience.
Hello, my name's John Marler. You talked about your earliest days and your sort of middle career. Would you like just to talk a little bit about the schools and colleges you attended?
Well, as you heard, I started my school life in Middlesbrough. I went to a school known as Winniebanks Primary School, which was, at that time, an amazing place. This is, I suppose I started there in the very early 1940s. The school had only been built like 5 years before that, and it was an amazingly modern school, almost German in a sense, that it incorporated a lot of perhaps Bauhaus thinking in its simplicity. It was a modern building which had internal courtyards. I remember we were given a small blanket to lie out in the sun when the sun shone. between lessons to rest. Primary colours were used for the tables and chairs in the classroom. It was a revelation to me. I realise in retrospect, it did influence me an awful lot.
Can we take another question, please?
Thanks very much, Sally Morrison. Will, I've known you for a number of years since you were in Australia. I would like to know the experiments you have had using all the different sorts of materials you've used. What is the stuff called that swells up and fills gaps? You've used that. Now, that's something that you would come across in a hardware shop. Can you give us an overview of what the sort of materials you've used and why you've used them and how you've been fascinated by them?
Okay, Sally. I think my father being in the hardware business has affected me, possibly subconsciously. But a lot of my work in the 1960s started using items of hardware, things like piano hinges and drawer handles, D handles, ring handles, that approach. And why I started using those, not only because I was familiar with them, but why I started using those was an attitude I have to how we read signals in our daily lives. For instance, in painting, you have the figuration, you have abstraction, and you have abstract. To me, they're, in a way, very similar. They're all the same thing. Figuration is just something we're very familiar with. We're able to stick a label on it and call it a tree or a piano hinge or a handle. But if one was not aware of the nature of that object and you were seeing it as if you'd come from outer space for the very first time, what on earth was it? How would you read it? The foam that you're talking about is a builder's material, expanding foam, for instance, which takes on the quality of a natural material, a sort of volcanic flow, as it were. Again, rather like the paint pouring through the grid being a controlling aspect. So in various ways, perhaps through hardware, I've been interested in control, how we read the world, how we are controlled by it. As I say, that's kind of a cerebral approach. On top of all that, you have to add a little passion as well. And I hope I'm able to instill that on top of the sort of black and white thinking.
And on that note, control and passion, can you show your appreciation, please, for William Tillyer?
William Tillyer, whose work is on show at the Bernard Jacobson Gallery in London until the end of November, and in the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art until February.